Hello there. I wanted to take a short break from my game development to discuss an essay that I had read by um, our good friend Franco Bifo Berardi, who, if you don't remember, he's that silly little anarchist guy that was one of the guys that Felix Guattari helped bail out in the late 70s, early 80s from all of the crazy fascist shit going on over there. So, he's actually, I haven't read a ton of his work, but what I have read I really enjoy. He's a very sentimental writer. He's very focused on, like, the sensual, and he really enjoys, focusing on the human touch and things like that. And I don't agree necessarily with everything that he writes, but he's an excellent writer from everything I've read so far of him. And I definitely recommend checking him out on his own. But just as a little update on my little game, I will have an update in a few days showing off the video of the game, and you'll have a demo that you'll be able to experiment with. And, I built it in a few weeks, so it's not going to be perfect, but it's making some great progress, and it's very functional right now. And it's really just a matter of, adding a couple extra features and polishing it up. And it's really exciting, too, because it's fully blind accessible, which means that blind people can play it. There was a couple of challenges that I encountered during the design, and I might discuss those challenges in another video sometime. But no, it was a very cool little game, and I'm really excited to show how it works once I wrap things up in the next few days for the jam. So I think I'm just gonna jump into this now. So this is an essay that Bifo clearly wrote about I'm gonna butcher his name, Luigi Mangione, or whatever his name is. I'll just call him Luigi because it's easier for me. For those new to the channel, I'm kind of notorious for butchering names around here. I'm not the best at pronunciation. And what this essay is really about, and I'm gonna have a link to it in the description so you can check it out for yourself. But really what this essay is about is kind of like the way that we kind of, as Americans, relate to the systems of violence that America is built upon, right? The philosophies of violence and control and insanity and just this deranged mentality that drives this country, and how it's erupting into more and more molecular forms of violence. And I wanted to discuss a couple of things that he talks about in this paper, because this paper really made me think for the last few days about a lot of things. And I also think that it's a good opportunity to discuss some interesting radical ideas from this perspective as a writer. He starts off by talking about how 10 years ago he was writing, about serial killers, and not the kind that you hear about in true crime, white women wine dramas, but rather, the kind that have become a prolific problem in the United States that people really don't want to have a real grown-up conversation with. The random mass shooters who, go into public places, especially vulnerable places like schools or churches or movie theaters or whatever, and they just kill a bunch of people, right? And, there's this shift from this being a exceptional phenomenon, something that gravitates all attention towards it into something that is like mundane and normal. You know, later in the essay, he talks about he talks about the shooting with the Columbine girl. I don't remember when that happened, but I mean, there's so many school shootings. Like, forgive me, but yeah. So there was a Columbine girl a while back who killed a bunch of people in a school shooting, and you know, Bifo is commenting here. You know, the young girl called the police from her cell phone when she realized that something bad was going on in the next classroom. Traumatized, not so much. The 10-year-old girl describes the scene without excessive emotion. She's smiling and remembers that she heard the voice of a teacher shouting, "Help, help." The young girl seems acquainted with the new reality. It forms part of the new normal in the age of extermination. And I think that this is really an interesting and thought-provoking, you know, element of this essay, because he's really emphasizing how, you know, in a way, like, part of the rift between generations is the acceleration of our relation to reality, right? You know, this acceleration into the world of screens and the world of machines, and not like Deleuze-Guattarian machines, I mean like literal machines, right? You know, and, you know, just kind of like becoming more and more increasingly alienated from the real world. You know, I think part of like the absurdity, you know, I remember, you know, 10 years ago, back when I was kind of an asshole, to be quite frank, you know, I started to pick up on how strange it was that the politics of this fantasy world that was going on the internet was starting to bleed into real life. You know, Harambe was something that people actually wrote in on their ballot in 2016 as a form of protest. And, you know, I know I'm not like trying to say that that's like the biggest thing ever or anything, but it was kind of like a leakage of this, you know, world that exists on the internet, right? Now, in this essay, you know, Bifo refers to it repeatedly as like an infosphere, right? And or like a new world that has emerged from, you know, media, right? So something that Guattari talks a lot about in his writing is these subjectification producing machines. And a good way to think of this is like a sort of device or social structure or anything like that that has the ability to mass produce ideas among a people. So this could include anything from, like, he uses the example of Plato's cave in I think it's Cinema of Desire, but he also uses the example of like architecture and cathedrals and things like that, and how they are able, through like just the way that they exist and function, they're able to produce a subjectivity that is experienced among a group of people. It's a way to control what people actually experience through building machines, right? And it's almost like what we're really experiencing, you know, in this modern, this postmodern hellscape, whatever you want to fucking call it. What we're really experiencing is, you know, the creation of an entire world that, you know, that was created through these machines, through the surfaces of these things. You know, Bifo focuses in this essay on like the proliferation of screens and how screens have, you know, caused people to like, you know, disconnect from reality. But when I first read this, my impression was, you know, like, that's a little bit of a boomer take, I guess. Like Like, you know, I know he's like in his 70s or whatever, but like, you know, that's kind of an old people take to focus on screens, like, oh, the phones are brainwashing you. But I sat down and thought about this a lot because, you know, I obviously, you know, care about computers and, you know, programming and stuff because, you know, I build games. I worked professionally as a programmer for a decade. And, you know, so there's a little bit of something at odds between me and you know, the first time I read this, my interpretation of what Bifo was saying, because it was kind of like, well, I'm behind computers a lot, you know, I'm behind screens a lot for just the nature of my work. I can't just say, like, screens inherently are bad, right? And I don't believe that screens are inherently bad. Screens kind of returned me back to the subject of these subjectivity producing machines. You know, is it bad that, you know, a church can use its architecture to evoke a certain kind of narrative with God? Is it bad that, you know, a movie can be mass produced and make people think a certain way? Not necessarily, you know, like, obviously Guattari didn't think that was a bad thing necessarily because he tried to exploit those ideas in his life. Now, it's been 30 years, a little over 30 years since he's died, and things have changed a lot since then. But I still don't think that, like, screens are inherently the problem. But upon rereading, it's more clear to me that really what Bifo is concerned about is the world that has been created on the screens. So, you know, some people may wonder why I want to seriously discuss Pokemon through the lens of Deleuze and Guattari. And I want to first say that even when Pokemon first came out, people were analyzing Pokemon through Deleuze and Guattari. It's not a novel concept. It's not something that, like, people thought that, like, would never happen. It's not something that nobody ever took seriously. People have been taking that idea seriously ever since it happened. And the reason why is because Pokemon is a fascinating story about this kind of, like, indie game piece of trash that barely works, was marketed in such a way and had a whole universe produced not just through screens but through a whole surface of media consumption, right, that produces you as a subject, as a Pokemon trainer, right? And, you know, this is a whole machine that is directly connected to a very capitalist system of economic, you know, extraction of value, right? And it's easy to just look at it like, give me a second, I'm gonna drink some coffee. It's easy to just look at it and be like, oh, well, yeah, of course, it was this multi-bazillion dollar project that made a lot of money, but in a way, you know, it was a really fascinating change in time for us in interacting with these screens because, you know, my generation was probably the first generation raised in the infosphere, you know, because I was born in 1993, you know, I was introduced to the internet, you know, when I was like maybe like 5-6 years old. And that was around the same time that I learned about Pokemon. Pokemon was one of my probably my major first experience on the internet at the time where the internet was growing more and more commercially accessible, especially to, you know, middle-class white people like where I was growing up, you know? And as a result, you know, I feel almost like a member of the first generation of this sort of experiment that has been conducted on these screens, right? So the problem is not really, you know, so when I first read this paper, my reaction was, no, Bifo, it's not just the screens, it's also what's on the screens. You know, you go on a Reddit, for example, you know, and what do you see? You see a particular arrangement, a particular assemblage of ideas. You know, you see Mangione in New York State Court, Joint Chiefs Chairman, fireman, Spider-Man 4 release push, AP sues White House, and you see this particular information in this order. And I use the example of Reddit because Reddit is pretty infamous publicly for being kind of infiltrated in this direction, you know, whether or not you're conservative or liberal, right? It's very infiltrated. I would say that, like, you know, for example, our conservative seems to be relatively infiltrated right now by the current regime in, you know, the current Elon Musk regime, right? And, you know, Reddit has always been very, very well known for being infiltrated in that way. I wasn't it Grizzly Maxwell who was a moderator on there or something? I don't know. But you get the point. Basically, the user interface arranges elements in such a manner that you engage with them in a very predictable and uniform way. It restrains what is possible with communication, you know? Like, you know, even something as simple as IRC has this problem because, you know, think about face-to-face communication, you know, and face-to-face communication is something that Bifo is very, you know, depressed about. You know, he's very depressed that my generation and the generations after mine struggle to, you know, feel each other's bodies and to, you know, have sensual real-world relations. And I understand personally the struggle that kind of alienation produces. And, you know, yes, part of that alienation is because of our relationship with labor, but a bigger part of that relationship to a bigger part of that alienation is our relationship to, you know, just media in general. Like, you know, going back to Pokemon, it turns us into individual Pokemon trainers. You know, it's almost like as if, you know, when we talk about Pokemon in real life, we aren't actually engaging in the Pokemon world, we're talking about it. And as a result, in order to really socialize in the Pokemon world, we have to be in Pokemon spaces, which can only exist online, it can only exist digitally. You know, we can't feel it in our bodies. You know, and that's almost something I kind of touched on a little in my Pokemon and gender video. You know, like a lot of people are complaining about the whole like bi-gendered cage comment where I say that, you know, girls who played Generation 1 in 1999 you know, had a weird split in their identity, a bi-gendered split where part of them had to express as male because of the limitations of the user interface, and part of them expressed as female because when they talked about it in real life, they're girls, right? And, you know, like, essentially what I'm getting at with that point is that the user interface itself restricts who we can be and how it creates our individuality, our identity. The reason why I focus so much on trying to, you know, use video games as an analogy for understanding Deleuze and Guattari is not just because it's a cute little curiosity, but because it is an example of Guattari's ideas in action. It is a physical application of, not like they read his ideas and they applied it, but rather, you know, it's an application of these concepts in the real world. It is literally what he is describing, you know, in an accessible way that is easy for people to understand. Like, yes, a lot of people were confused by my video, largely because I wasn't expecting an audience of, like, people who expect me to write like MatPat, which is crazy. Like, I know I'm not writing like MatPat for my videos. I apologize if you can't consume, you know, what I'm talking about. Maybe take the time to, you know, try to learn a little bit and try to, like, introduce yourself to the concepts instead of just being hostile to it because it's not immediately consumable for you. Like, you know, I understand that, like, a lot of educators are sympathetic towards, you know, the problem, but also some of the problem we have to take some responsibility for our inability to, or our lack of desire to actually, like, learn more than something that is 5 minutes long, you know, because part of the conditioning that we've suffered through through these user interfaces, through this rapid content that is proliferating on these screens, is stopping to think. And that's another concept that Bifo goes over in this essay. He talks about how the U.S. is being grasped in this sort of like new sort of polar condition, where on one side you have the violence and dementia of the United States, where like the United States, just in case anybody's watching this is confused or controversial or whatever, the United States is an extremely violent country that has based its entire existence on the violence and extermination of people and the exploitation of bodies to essentially create and manufacture a society that only benefits the elite. And in order to uphold that society, it has to be upheld through violence. But it's a kind of violence where most kinds of desired violence are heavily repressed through the law. Like we pretend that as a Western society that we're civilized and stuff, but we have cops that beat the shit out of people for literally just not having a home, or being suspected as being a criminal for being a racial minority or something. Like this is a society of violence, and the reason why you don't see it is because, well, most of my viewers are probably white. That's probably why it doesn't impact you. You are part of the class of society that benefits from this violence. And however, the thing is that this violence is heavily repressed through like these sort of this sort of like neoliberal egalitarian lie that we're all following the same law, and the law says that it's wrong to murder people, right? That doesn't mean that they don't get away with murdering people. Like look at Luigi Mangione. He fucking killed the CEO because the CEO was a mass murderer who got away with killing thousands of people every year, but in a way that got away around the law, right? And again, you can kind of see how the direct violence is repressed in individuals, but in systems that don't have an individualist identity, they're allowed to murder as much as they want within this society. And really, these microscopic eruptions of violence that we're seeing, and again, I agree entirely with Bifo that there's nothing revolutionary about what Luigi did. There's nothing praxis about it. There's nothing revolutionary about it. He committed an act of aggressive violence. I mean, it's funny. It's good to joke about, I guess. And there's a lot to say about the impact of humor and joking about these things on, how we see the world, that I don't really want to go into right now. But, he was not like really a revolutionary subject. I mean, hell, I kind of felt a little bit punched in the gut a little bit when Bifo kind of like, he talks about Pokemon, which, by the way, if Bifo ever watches this, I think it is worth noting a little bit of context behind that. As a Pokemon programmed infosphere resident, okay. Basically, what that reference that Luigi posted was Breloom is that green dinosaur thing. And he is a grass and fighting type, and types are like elements that the monsters have. And Bullet Seed is an attack that hits 2 to 5 times a turn. Normally attacks only hit once per turn, but Bullet Seed is a special attack that can hit 2 to 5 times, and it's random. And you can kind of see how, the seeds kind of like correlate with bullets and all this crap, and it's really cheesy. Like, people, when we found out about it, we were all kind of shocked that the guy who committed such a high profile act of violence was kind of a dork, to be honest. Like, we were like, what the hell? But and was a weirdo, but a lot of people are worshiping him, and just like, because like if you look at the graphic up here, this was a popular image, but there's a bunch of images that are similar to that, because his actions of violence represent the kind of violence that people want to retaliate with from the systemic violence that occurs in our nation. And, I think going back to the infosphere thing, something I really wanted to talk about was, like I said before, I was raised on the early internet. I was raised through the 2000s where everyone was a crazy asshole on the internet. Like, when people say they want the internet to be like how it used to be, that should be a huge red flag to anybody who sees that. Like, maybe you're too young to remember. For some of my viewers are probably too young to remember really what it was like in the 2000s, but we were crazy assholes. Like, holy shit, you don't want to go back to that. Like there's a reason why everything from that period, with the exception of a couple of classic animations and stuff, were just really bad. And it's because we had a really toxic culture online back then. Imagine if you're older, imagine instead of being raised around a society where you have physical consequences for your actions that actually matter, right? You're raised in a community online where everything is just kind of like this virtual battle. There's nothing that really grounds your behavior. So bullying is something that became very popular on the internet in those days, because that's how you could gain momentum in these interfaces, right? They're so simple that you can just optimize how to engage with them. Something that is happening right now with all the AI, all of the that's taking over Facebook and shit, right? Okay, obviously I can tell that Shrimp Jesus is AI generated, but these feeds are designed to be scrolled through with less than a few seconds of looking at a particular post. I'm sure that a couple of us, if not all of us, have been tricked at least once or twice by an AI generated picture, avatar, video, whatever. It's And the thing about that AI generation is, and mind you, I'm not completely opposed to everything AI generated. I'm not a super aggressive anti-AI person, but the real problem with this AI crap is that it's being pushed in a way to eliminate the human element of communication. It's trying to get rid of and slaw off, what makes a human, and I think this kind of goes back to what Bifo is saying about, dementia, right? If you think about what dementia is metaphorically, it's the breakdown of these complex social structures that make us really a participant in human society, right? And and I've thought about this a lot. I've thought about how being this resident of the infosphere really kind of programmed my desires in a particular way, where not only do I want to do what I'm told, but I don't want to think too hard about it. And I noticed that with my Pokemon and gender video, people got angry at me because I was thinking too deeply about things, or, it's not that deep, bro. And it's first off, I'm just having fun. Don't worry about it if that it doesn't really matter if it's too deep, bro. Obviously a video about Pokemon and gender really doesn't matter that much in the long run, because it's about a series of fictional animals. Who really cares that deeply about the subject, right? But secondly, it was just the fact that people don't want to think. People don't want to have that interiority. They want to react. There's this attitude, especially in more conservative circles regarding media, analysis, that things are good because they make me feel something. And it really explains why, these people hate literature about minorities, because why would they feel anything special about a story about a minority? They can't relate to those minorities in real life. They don't want to relate to those minorities in real life. They don't have interest in the question of what does it really mean to feel like this, And So one thing I also want to talk about in this article is, Bifo says something a little controversial here. I feel like some people who are in my audience will read this and they'll just immediately like close off the article and just be like, this boomer doesn't understand my struggle or whatever. And I do want to talk a little bit about this. He says, I think that this new behavior should not be read as psychopathological, but rather as a mutation. More and more psychiatrists are diagnosing children with ADHD. Attention deficit disorders, they say, are disturbing children's minds and disrupting the normal process of education. I think this diagnosis is bullshit. It is a completely useless and misleading to pathologize the condition in which the connected brain finds itself. The behavior that psychiatrists and educators define as pathology is simply and understandably a desperate attempt to adapt one mental's rhythm to the infospheric rhythm. Now, yeah, I know some people will read that and be pissed off that he's saying ADHD is bullshit. They're probably thinking, I need to take my meds in order to, make sense of anything. How dare you, right? And I think that this is actually a good opportunity to challenge the views of, psychiatry that currently dominate the discourse surrounding the problems of ADHD, autism, and other things like that. Something that's really frustrating as somebody who is, seriously mentally ill, somebody who, yes, I can function online, I can act like a normal person online, but that's, again, because I'm a resident of the infosphere, I know how to function here, but in real life, I'm not, completely, destructive or anything, but it's kind of obvious that I have a disability. It's not something as invisible as I would hope, it's something that people definitely notice. It's something that people have definitely discriminated against me on in real life. So, I understand the physiological relations and that are produced from having a disability. However, especially one of a mental or psychiatric nature. However, I really want to use this as an opportunity to challenge that the problem itself is one that is rooted in something that can really be identified through this identity of a diagnosis. What Bifo is really criticizing here is not the existence of neurotypes or neurodiversity or whatever you want to call it. Really what's happening here is that ADHD emerged not because it's a biological difference in people's brains. Every single person's brain is slightly biologically different than the other, right? Really where it's emerging is a particular relationship in society. That's why you don't have ADHD necessarily, mentioned in ancient texts. I could be wrong about this. I'm not an expert on the psychiatric history of ancient peoples, right? I'm sure that it's a fascinating field that somebody can correct me on. But what is described as ADHD in the modern world probably didn't exist the same way back then. And that doesn't mean that the chemicals in people's brains were the same or different. In fact, they were probably different because of, minor genetic drift and stuff, but they were probably approximately the same, right? So, you still have this difference, right? But the thing is that the real difference arises not from the brains themselves, but rather the society that is classifying them. As our society accelerates, as our society becomes more and more information-driven, more and more based on this short-circuiting of abstraction and automation of language, right? What is happening is that our bodies are reacting to that, and the difference in patients with ADHD is that their bodies react in such a way where taking particular medications such as Adderall or Ritalin allows them to be able to function more in this heavily information-driven society. That's really what Bifo is getting at here. He is saying that our ability to conceive and understand this problem being pushed through the lens of psychiatry means that we're ignoring what is actually producing this problem in people in the first place, which is the hyper acceleration of information. And I believe that, a lot of what we are experiencing as like a mass psychosis in society is driven by this machine. It is not a genetic thing that can be identified by fucking CRISPR and be eliminated. It is caused instead by our environment being more and more unhealthy. I mean, if you raise an animal, right, and you have it in an enclosure that is not appropriate for it, it doesn't matter like what its genetics are. Yeah, some genetic profiles will be able to deal with the poor conditions better than others, but that doesn't mean that the animal necessarily, it's the problem in the animal. It's a problem in the, but it's not a problem within the animal itself. It's a problem within, the enclosure. It's just that some animals are better at surviving it than others. And so I guess, and that's important because, I've experienced my own breakdown of my mental capabilities because of this proliferation of the infosphere as well. Like a big part of my schizophrenic experience, which, by the way, for people who are new to my channel, I'm diagnosed bipolar 1, but I call myself schizophrenic because my experiences are, quite frankly, when I shared them with people online, I just relate more to people who are schizophrenic than are necessarily bipolar. Like, I have the bipolar element, I have the mood swings, but I also have very schizophrenic experiences. So, keep that in mind when I'm saying this. And that's part of the reason why I'm pretty critical of the diagnosis-based culture surrounding mental health discussion that we have today. But yeah, even for me, this like relationship that we have with information really screwed me up because, one, I thought that I could automate my brain to basically be immune to breaking down, to psychosis, to avoid like the fate of being consumed by misinformation and pseudoscience. I was a hyper-rationalist, atheist, thinking bro who was like, yeah, I got this. I didn't got this. I went completely psychotic. I had completely embarrassing delusions that lasted for years. And, I'm still dealing with the consequences of what happened to me on my brain and my body and my life. So, but yeah, like I was like this super hyper rationalist, person, right, who thought that I could solve everything in my brain. And, but that's because I wasn't connected to the real world, because I had always been raised in the infosphere, because, I came from a really abusive household. I was not allowed to go outside and hang out with people, and as a result, I was raised on the internet, and I was among some of the the earliest people raised on the internet this way. And so as a consequence, this essay kind of is about, in a way, so-called my people, this generation of weirdos and schizos and bizarros who were raised on the internet, who were trained in the semiotic of Pokemon and all this other weird meme shit. And, my goal is to break free from it, not necessarily to say that screens are all bad and I have to escape from all screens, but rather a desire to be free from, all of those other things, like just being free from the information that is produced from this like mass-produced organism that has stretched across the entire world, yeah, okay, Fediverse exists, but Fediverse also copies a lot of the same UI patterns that you see on Twitter or Facebook. In fact, it's designed around those UI patterns to pull people back in. It doesn't really solve the problem of those UI patterns producing relationships that we have with reality that are just not, you know, conductive to a non-alienated existence. We need to find a relationship with technology that connects people. And I think a big part of that is not just going to be technology, but also our relationship with media. You know, everybody's concerned about how AI is taking the jobs of artists, and the thing that we really have to ask ourselves in that relationship is, why did we really want the artist in the first place? You know, a lot of people just want an artist so that they can have pornography drawn of their original characters. They don't really care about the artist's original touch. They're not there because the artist has an amazing style. They're there because they want porn. And there are people who are going to also want to support the artist because they like that human connection, but because of the way that we have been told to engage with anonymous people online for, you know, decades, and even despite our attempts to try to remove that and our attempts to try to reverse that, we are still trapped in this kind of bubble of like trying to alienate ourselves. And so really kind of what I want to close in on with this kind of ramble is, I think what we really need to take from Bifo's essay here, right, is one, the US is about to get very violent, right? And I really don't belong here. I am not I mean, I can get annoyed and aggressive, like, from being, you know, repeatedly harassed, but I don't like being violent. I don't like being aggressive. I don't like violence around me, right? And the thing is that my home is about to get a lot more violent, a lot more aggressive. I don't know what is in my future, and I don't know where the future holds. Thankfully, where I live and where I'm at is relatively safe for trans people. So, but there's still a lot of like division and aggression, and a lot of psychosis. And it's not a psychosis where one is occupied by a huge internal world that stretches in a million directions that could go anywhere, like what I experienced with my schizophrenia, but one where it closes in on itself and alienates itself from the rest of the world, you know, in a dementia, you know, that progressively grows more and more disconnected from the human discourse. And yeah, so that's my thoughts on this. I hope you're doing well. In a few days, you'll see my game, and it will be great. Take care.